I would love to introduce Megan Higgins from Avalara, where she is the VP and General Manager of e-commerce and marketplaces. Megan, thanks so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, maybe I'm sure many of the folks in the audience have come across Avalara, but perhaps have not been aware that they have. So perhaps you can take a moment and provide a little background on what it is that Avalara does and talk a little bit more about your current role there as well.
Sure. So Avalara is the leader in cloud-based compliance technology. So really, we're the genie behind the scenes around calculating tax and making sure that all of those transactions that are either happening in your ERP or in your e-commerce business are being done accurately, and then managing all of the heavy lifting around remittance to all the different states and government authorities, et cetera. So I joined Avalara about a year ago, and I've been lucky to be able to lead our marketplace and e-commerce sector part of the business. And so essentially, we have over 700 partners that we work with, and many of those partners are technology providers that all of us in e-commerce work with today, like Shopify and BigCommerce, and then marketplaces such as Amazon and Etsy. And so we've got a strong footprint around this space. And so my responsibility ultimately is to make sure that we are creating more value in those relationships, we're growing those relationships, and we're meeting the demand that is currently happening in this space around scaling tax compliance technology to all of the merchants that are coming online and as their businesses grow.
Amazing. Thanks for that background. As we sort of get into the conversation, part of the reason that you and I are speaking today is there has been a partnership between PSFK and Avalara to create a piece of content, which I know will be available for everyone who is tuning in today to download and consume, which is called the Digital Commerce Playbook. In it, we talk about sort of key trends within and technologies across 5 stages of the digital purchase journey. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why your company felt that it was necessary to kind of have this larger conversation and create this report sort of at this moment.
Yeah, sure. Well, consumer expectations are continuing to increase. And if you look at the onset of what's happening in e-commerce nowadays, it's evolved. I've been in e-commerce for the last 15 years, and it continues to evolve, it transforms. And even in the last couple of years, technology and the adoption of technology is making it harder to compete. So you really have to be sure that you're staying current with those capabilities and what the consumer is looking for so that you can grow your business alongside the demand of what's happening out there. And even in the onset of COVID, that's even further accelerated what the e-commerce growth and what's happening around the need to really invest in your operations so that you can deliver that great experience that consumers are looking for. So you can start to garner loyalty and repeat business, et cetera. So, really for Avalara, we wanted to be able to support the message around, since we're involved in so many of these transactions, how do we contextualize the importance of investing in technology to make sure that you can grow and scale your business with this increasing demand? It's unprecedented, and it's exciting. It presents a huge opportunity, but the investment in automation and technology is super important, which is where we can certainly help.
Yeah, it's amazing. Obviously, from a sort of operational point of view, there's so much out there and so many different decisions that a company has to sort of consider as a part of this. And then, you have people that are at different points in that sort of transformation journey. And as you mentioned, with everything sort of accelerating as a result, there's been a lot of, fast decision making that has needed to happen as a result. So given the sort of COVID-19 backdrop, I wonder if you can start by talking a little bit about some of the bigger consumer shifts that you're seeing in the marketplace and really sort of paying attention to right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even just touching a bit on the impact of COVID, the tailwinds of growth. It's interesting. I saw a statistic the other day that May, it was 77% growth year over year with almost 83 billion in sales. And so that growth trajectory, we've been lucky to have double digit growth over the last several years, but now it's just accelerated. What you ordinarily see in 4 to 6 years is now accelerated in 2 to 3 months. And so the the amount of activity happening online, and also the newness of consumers that are starting to enter e-commerce, it will have a permanent effect. So it is here to stay, and that's where we, all of us in this space, have to start paying attention to that. There are more consumers, that there are new consumers in the mix that ordinarily are not accustomed to buying online, and so all of this demand around more scale, and really the importance of the experience is just so paramount. So I would say for retailers, when COVID first happened, we had focused a bit of the story around how to help them get online. So many businesses were scrambling because they simply couldn't support foot traffic any longer. And our message was really around how can we help you quickly get online and transform your business from being a standalone shop to being able to be available to purchase remotely. And so that was sort of stage one. And now, as we look at the evolution of what's happened the last few months, and the fact that this is really a bit of a permanent change, that now we're trying to help educate businesses around the investment in operations. So the focus around how to make sure that you can be discovered, how to ensure that your checkout and your payments is a seamless experience, and looking all the way through post-purchase experience and post-purchase activity on the importance of fulfillment and transparency and convenience. People nowadays want to be able to buy online, pick up in store, making sure you've got visibility to your inventory. All of those attributes are so important. And so it's not just about simply getting online. That was step one. Get online, make sure that you've got the fundamentals to be able to keep your business running. But now it's a shift towards investing in back office operations, so you've got that end to end journey really covered, and you can continue to scale your business.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the sort of new consumers who are hopping on to the sort of digital commerce experience. I mentioned this earlier today, but my parents are in their 70s, and while certainly they've done a little bit of online shopping out of necessity, there was just a lot more that they were expected to sort of learn, and they're not the most digitally savvy people, certainly, but you add them into the
It's
people
a
who are
mix.
already participating, and that's a huge sort of bump in traffic, and a different level of sort of expectation amongst consumers who are kind of coming into things. So
Exactly right. And all of us that are sort of digitally native, we're accustomed to just getting information, getting status information, managing your returns process, all through the online experience. But there is this new population now that doesn't know how to do that. And so they're inclined to want to pick up the phone. So now you got to manage multiple channels to support them. And I agree. My parents are also in their 70s, and they've done more online shopping than they ever have, and they don't really know what they're doing. So add that complexity into the mix.
yeah, it's pretty crazy, and I think to your point that some of that, when people find something that works, and they're gonna just that behavior over time becomes embedded, and so they're sort of here to stay for certain level. You hinted on this or hinted at this a little bit, but when you talked about the sort of shopper journey, I think there's a tendency for retailers particularly to sort of think about each of these sort of components in like very distinct
Yeah.
stages, but in reality, everything is kind of a part of a longer tail journey, and everything sort of impacts one another. So I guess you where maybe you can talk a little bit about why that sort of holistic view of that sort of shopper journey is an important sort of framing to take from a retail point of view.
For sure, for sure. And the lines on those various stages that were once bespoke stages are all becoming very blurred because it all points to the experience. And so the next generation of the customer experience is really about seamlessness, accuracy, transparency, flexibility. And that you have to stitch all those things together to be able to deliver upon that promise. And that's why there aren't sort of unique attributes around the digital commerce journey. It's really one journey, and so the more you can collapse that and think about the end-to-end experience, stepping back from the foothold of the consumer, that's where that will make a lot of sense. But there's a lot of pressure right now on retailers to deliver that interconnected experience. And getting back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is it's all about the investment in technology. The good news is there is a tremendous amount of technology and automation tools available, most of which are native and embedded in your e-commerce platform today. So it's not as if you have to go out and create all these disparate integrations. You just have to look at what you need, make sure that you're being thoughtful about that process, and enable those tools, focusing on the front end around discovery, all the way through to the back end around post-purchase and transparency. That's that is that's really the best practice around making sure that you've got that customer experience front and center every time.
And you mentioned the sort of notion of customer experience, and I wonder if we can dig a little bit deeper into that in terms of how do you sort of see or define what that sort of next gen CX experience looks like in terms of that sort of digital commerce experience?
Yeah, I mean, there are several best practice examples out there. If you think about how do consumers want to discover products, I even think about myself nowadays. I've discovered more new retailers and more new, apparel items through my Facebook or my Instagram feed than ever before. So social discovery is really important. You have to be where the consumer is and make sure that you're taking advantage of those opportunities to translate visualization to the buy opportunity. And that's connecting those two seamlessly is super important. Also thinking about how consumers want to be able to pick up their items or return their items. A great example is the partnership that Amazon had done with Kohl's, where you can bring your Amazon boxes back to your Kohl's experience, or Kroger's and Walgreens. They've now developed a partnership. So if you think about how you can create relationships around the consumers already at a location, how do you make it easier for them to complete, what would ordinarily be another step in their process around returns? I mean, returns is unfortunately the painful reality of the world we live in, and it's increasing. And so you got to be sure that is not another cumbersome process that the consumer still has to solve for.
Yeah, it's interesting how you sort of have spoken about this. I think there's that sort of notion you mentioned, sort of being where consumers are, and then almost figuring out how to kind of collapse multiple steps. It's sort of like integrating more closely into the sort of fabric of people's sort of daily lives and figuring out these new ways of serving them, which I think is really great and interesting to sort of consider. I mean, you sort of hinted at this a little bit, but I mean, from a personal perspective, I wonder if there's anything either that's happened recently or just like in the past, in terms of, as you think about like a standout commerce experience that you've had that you could share.
Yeah, since COVID started, I've been so impressed with actually our local restaurants and our local small businesses, at least in the area that I live in. Their agility to be able to transform from a pretty traditional business where, you have to dine in or it's, over the phone, pick up orders, et cetera. And so, in our area, as an example, these small businesses have very quickly figured out to get their business online, to order online, and then to have the ability to order online and pick up or delivery. That is, it's really been remarkable to watch some of these small businesses out of absolute necessity, but they have accelerated their adoption of technology. And frankly, many people in the town that I live in have been hugely receptive to that. So they've saved their business to some degree, and they've transformed their business to make sure that they can keep going. And so that, I think, has been remarkable. Now, conversely, there's also experiences where, and it always comes down to, Scott, it always comes down to really the transparency and communication. So inevitably through this environment, shipments get delayed. The expectation around how quickly you're going to get items, I think we've all relaxed that to some degree. But being able to see where your item is, and if it hasn't arrived, is just so basic. And saying, where is it? If it hasn't arrived yet, how do I get to see where it is? And then if I have to return something, I don't want to have to pick up the phone. If you think about when somebody has to pick up the phone, with the exception of our 70-year-old parents, it's a fractured experience. Everything should be able to be done online. You should be able to print a return label. You should be able to see where your shipment is, even if it is delayed. And that's just one attribute that I continue to see retailers.
So often we want to turn our attention to sort of major players, and and you mentioned it's sort of out of necessity, but also they are in a position to kind of be experimental and are forced to kind of innovate. And I think there's a lot that can be learned in the sort of
For sure.
bigger space around that. And then that sort of level of openness and proactivity in terms of how that communication that needs to exist there, I think, is like really critical as well.
Yeah.
um, so I know that as a business, Avalara is really sort of focused on the payments and checkout experience, and that's something that I think it's easy to kind of take for granted in terms of it's just another mechanic within that process, but there's obviously a lot of complexity within the context of that. Um, so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, what are some of those key things that retailers need to keep in mind in order to ensure that at that sort of, critical moment that they're
Yes.
not losing shoppers there.
Yeah, well said. I've always characterized the payments checkout component to the digital commerce experience. It is the crown jewel. You've worked so hard to bring shoppers into your store. You've worked so hard to make sure your inventory is current and your pictures are beautiful and your pricing is correct. And when they get to that checkout experience, it's just absolutely vital to be sure that you can convert them at that stage. And so you'd be surprised, it is still incredibly complex, that a lot of retailers still struggle with, and still don't necessarily give the right amount of focus on. So I would say that there are a few people that want to have to be sourcing through and say, okay, they don't accept Apple Pay, and that's how I like to pay. Be flexible about those payment options. The second is, if you think about the adoption of mobile, and people are shopping on any device wherever they might be, that one-click checkout ability to just seamlessly buy is just so important. I mean, I think about my own shopping experience, and I never have a credit card handy. I've memorized my credit card number, but I'm thankful that many of the retailers that I shop with also have that stored securely. They tokenize that, and so I can just seamlessly check out, and there's no friction in that experience. And lastly, certainly as it relates to Avalara, getting the tax right. So if you think about the impact of sales tax, nobody wants to worry about sales tax. That's why it's really, really advantageous to just outsource that. But if you think about the impact of sales tax, if you get it wrong, you can subject yourself to having to have extra costs that are due, on your books. Certainly exposure to an audit, but also just making sure that the consumer has an accurate amount that they have to pay. I mean, consumers, are pretty savvy, and they'll notice that if that's incorrect. And so getting tax right is important, and just getting everything accurate and out the door is just so important.
Yeah, and one of the things I actually found fascinating in sort of learning more about Avalara as we were doing this piece of research is the sort of implication in terms of that sort of global commerce piece.
Mhm.
And obviously, given the world that we live in now, it's not just as easy as sort of like putting up a website and then allowing anyone anywhere to kind of purchase from you across the border. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what are some of those additional kind of friction points that companies need to be aware of as they sort of try to grow that audience and sell to them.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually the background that I came from before joining Avalara. I was working in a global e-commerce environment, and I'm glad you mentioned that because once you put your store online, inherently you are now global. You're open for business, and there are global shoppers that are likely coming to your site every day looking to purchase. And there's a lot of friction and there's a lot of complexity around that. Not simply being able to ship it, but you have to worry about duties and taxes. You have to worry about import regulations, restrictions, making sure that that end user also has visibility, because a lot of times in the course of the shipment transaction, it will go dark to some degree because you're in customs and you're in places where you will not have a shipping event to be able to surface to that end buyer. So where Avalara steps in is right around that idea of transparency, making sure that at the point of checkout, the buyer knows here's all the potential costs, or here's the guaranteed cost, depending upon what policy you want to implement for your business. Here's all the costs that you can anticipate. And so that idea of landed cost is really a game changer around the consumer experience now globally. So making sure that the end consumer knows, okay, the item might be $100, but I'm going to have about $20 to $25 in duties and taxes. That's also going to be incremental to whatever that shipping cost will be. And if you don't prepay that, you'll likely have to pay that upon delivery. And shockingly, many consumers don't know that. And that then becomes, a fractured experience where they don't want to pay it. And then the retailer has to worry about, well, how do I get it back? And it's just as expensive, and not more as expensive, to bring those items back into the US as a return.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think about that from the standpoint of, something like Ticketmaster, which for the longest time always had sort of like fees associated with a ticket, but instead of sort of presenting that early in the process, classically, it was always like, you've gotten to the checkout and you're like, oh, actually the ticket is going to be,
And it's a lot.
yeah,
Yeah, it was not trivial. So I agree. I bought many of those tickets and realized, wow, but you're so far in, and you've chosen your seats and you've sort of committed to that. And it's no different. It's a great parallel example to the cross-border experience.
Yeah, it's crazy because, yeah, to your point, like it doesn't feel like, it feels like you're being taken advantage of, where there's a sort of fix that could have easily been put in place there. So I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess as a close, you've talked about, I think, some of the keys here are flexibility, seamlessness, being transparent in terms of, not just payments, but throughout the process, which I think is really incredible. And as a reminder, as all of you have been listening along, there is a version to the full report that Meg and I have been talking about in sort of in the background of our conversation today. So please feel free to download that. And Meg, thanks so much for taking the time and chatting with us today.
Scott, it was my pleasure, and encourage everyone to download that playbook. There's a lot of really good tips and solution options to recommend. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone.